this is also a time of change for my family.
Buckingham Palace had withstood years of whispered doubt, public divisions, and family scandals, but nothing. The monarchy was ready for today's announcement. Princess Anne and Prince William did not discuss any further short-term changes, or the royal itinerary was trimmed once again. They made a permanent announcement. King Charles was withdrawing from active sovereign duties for good, and a brand new coronation scheme was already being developed. For the man would get everything. Before delving further into the true implications of this for the royal family, you ensure you don't miss any updates. Make sure you subscribe. For a moment, William grasped the last page of the declaration. He dropped the paper, read his father's name twice, and inquired this. Was Charles sure? Yes, was the response. Rather than say anything, the prince folded the page. This wasn't a limited calendar or temporary delegation. The transmission of active sovereign responsibility forever, which would imply Charles would no longer bear the monarch's constitutional duty. That changed unpredictability into succession. Anne instantly comprehended the weight. She shut the adjacent door before the declaration and informed William that it was one thing to accept her brother's choice, but it was quite another to be prepared to lose him as ruler. He responded to that. They had not had time to feel prepared. Her presence next to him provided strong ceremonial support. She served as the link between one reign and the next as the king's sister. The sealed planning folder then materialized. William opened it and discovered a shortened procession, updated guest categories, a suggested coronation date window, and his directive to prioritize continuity above spectacle in the event. A coronation is the official ceremony where a new monarch is crowned in public and swears allegiance to the nation. The specifics demonstrated something unpleasant. The declaration today was not made on the spur of the moment. They had already made preparations. Charles had taken it a step further. Softer phrasing was recommended by palace advisors, however. The statement's most powerful line, permanently stepping aside, came straight from him. He did not want Britain to wait for a homecoming that he had determined would never occur. William put the coronation folder next to the statement signed by his father. Anne put her hand on the table and glanced at the documents and muttered, "Then there can be no turning back." However, there was one unanswered question. Why had? After a lifetime of preparation for the throne, Charles made an irreversible decision. Anne was aware that the response would surface. William was already aware of the starting point. Inside Windsor, during a private event that altered his father's fully thinking. The three individuals had to be understood before anyone could comprehend the new coronation, poised in the middle of a choice that none of them had anticipated. Three members of the same family were dealing with three distinct types of loss behind the wording of the Constitution. Charles was giving up the role that had shaped nearly his whole life. Before William had emotionally prepared for it, he was being pushed onto the throne, and Anne was trapped between. Her nephew and brother had grown to be the only people. Both men trusted enough to listen to what neither could easily speak to the other. Charles had been training for the throne for decades, enduring years when the throne appeared to be both far away and unavoidable. Because of this, stepping down was more painful than just cancelling appointments. The job had evolved into the ultimate goal of a life, centered on duty, expectation, and service. William comprehended succession in theory. However, reality proved more difficult than theory. He had anticipated time to gradually get ready, time to shield Catherine and their kids from the crown's full force. That meticulous timeline had now fallen apart. William asked the question that both men had been putting off almost overnight. He asked if Charles wanted the coronation postponed while seated across from his father without any formalities. The monarch did not respond. Right away, he meticulously aligned each document as he moved it, as though the desk's order may somehow govern the atmosphere in space. The official event that formally validates and crowns a new sovereign is called a coronation. Delaying it would result in an uneasy transition for the nation. At last, Charles looked up and said that the monarchy could not be suspended just because the family was in pain. Annie became impatient when she heard the constraint in both voices. She informed her brother that William was deserving of sincerity rather than polished royal rhetoric. Later, she turned on her nephew with equal vigor, cautioning him not to interpret Charles's composed demeanor as a lack of emotion. The king had merely dedicated his life to knowing how to, behind duty, conceal personal suffering. William paid attention, but the argument persisted. He was being asked to proceed, but He was being purposefully moved back by the man who had raised him. Then Charles made a very private request. He has no desire to. His last several months in the area became a protracted goodbye tour. He contended that having two centers of royal authority would confuse the nation and undermine William before his rule had fully started. The change had to be decisive. However, the prince did not allow decisiveness to be interpreted as refusal. William discreetly told coronation organizers that his father must never look defeated or abandoned. Inside the ceremony, a special spot would be made for him that would maintain Charles's dignity without making it unclear who held sovereign power. The king finally positioned the briefing packet between them and shoved it in the direction of his son without opening it. After a few seconds of not touching it, William placed his palm on the cover, while insolently observed the two men. However, her worries went beyond this unpleasant exchange. Anne recalled that evening. At first, Charles acknowledged that he might never be able to fully assume the responsibilities of kingship. Just a few hours before that confession, something had occurred, something detailed enough to transform uncertainty into conviction. Additionally, the rationale that one intimate evening in Windsor transformed ambiguity into a choice, which is how the coronation folder came to be. Today's announcement did not start a long-term retreat. It started at a private evening gathering in Windsor, when Charles went in for a routine overview of his impending responsibilities and left with doubts about his ability to hold the throne at all. One specific moment would be remembered by all in attendance. Halfway throughout a briefing, the king paused, took off his glasses, and informed Anne that he could no longer guarantee the institution what it needed from him. Charles had already experienced diminished timetables, assigned appearances, and meticulous modifications. This meeting, however, was unique. In front of him was a 12-month program that brought together constitutional audiences, substantial family responsibilities, investments, state ceremonies, and international commitments. Constitutional audiences are official gatherings where the ruler performs crucial state functions. They cannot just vanish because a diary gets challenging. He stopped reading the schedule halfway through and instructed all of the aides to leave, with the exception of Anne and William. The entire evening's significance was altered by the ensuing stillness. After months of refusing to speak it, Charles finally acknowledged it. It was no longer sufficient to cut individual engagements. The crown still needed one person to be on hand, trustworthy, and prepared to take charge without making the organization wonder every week who would take action. He turned to face his son and stated that William would be stuck between acting ruler and heir indefinitely, which would be the worst-case scenario. Anne shoved return right away. She advised her brother that the remainder of his reign shouldn't be determined by one trying night. However, that the monarch did not flee. Before anyone explicitly stated it, William sensed the meaning. He repositioned his chair and told his father that succession could never feel like a son taking advantage of his parents' weariness. The prince had invested years getting ready to inherit. However, he declined to take advantage of Charles's hardship. Anne observed the two men. The same pain can be circled in different directions. One was afraid to hang on too long. The other was afraid to move forward too soon. Charles then opened a drawer. He took out a handwritten note and set it down on the table, in between them. A memorandum is merely a written statement of a stance or conclusion, but this one contained much more tweet. It outlined the circumstances in which he would retire permanently. Anne's face instantly transformed. That night, her brother had not thought of this prospect. He had been getting ready for it in private. Charles took off his signature ring and placed it next to the document. "Before you hear this as my son, I need you to hear it as my heir." William hasn't touched the document yet. He didn't reach for it until Anne whispered to him to read. 1. He was stopped by the punishment. According to the document, maintaining continuity may occasionally necessitate a sovereign to give up any personal attachment to the position before the institution was compelled by ambiguity to make that choice on his behalf. William read it twice, then he ceased to argue. At last, Anne acknowledged that Charles had reached his own breaking point. However, acceptance did not imply consent. She fiercely resumed her resistance as soon as he increased the suggested speed of William's coronation. The choice had been said out loud at last. However, it was simpler to decide who would bear the responsibility than to decide how soon the crown ought to move on. There were no ministers, advisors, or ceremonies involved in the first significant conflict over the new rule planners. It took place between Charles and Anne behind a closed door. William was seated just a few feet away from his brother and my sister disagreed about the timeliness of another coronation in Britain. Then Anne uttered the words that brought the room to a halt. Chilly. He cannot be crowned, as if the man he is replacing has not changed. Charles desired quickness because uncertainty was getting risky. If the transfer took longer than expected, William might have to bear the weight of a sovereign without being permitted to achieve full sovereignty. The public event that validates and crowns a new monarch. Additionally, if it is postponed too long, the nation may feel caught between two regimes. That reasoning made sense to Anne. The notion that her brother's exit should be handled so swiftly that his entire reign appeared to have been cleared was what she rejected away. Anne leaned forward and expressed her thoughts to Charles. She claimed that responsibility had turned into a shield. He was attempting to control his own departure as if it were a different schedule, another briefing, another regal duty that might be fulfilled and stored away. At last, the king lost his temper. He said it would be worse to be only partially present. His dignity could not be preserved at the expense of making William rule under the threat of a guy who could return, might not return, and would leave the entire institution that is emotionally immobile. William sensed that both sides were closing in on him. Every conversation regarding the coronation seemed sensible until he recalled the purpose of the event. His father had walked on the crown, therefore he was heading toward it. Steer clear of it. At last, the prince asked them both to stop. According to him, the responsibility shift would continue, both instantaneous and permanent. However, the ceremony itself did not need to act as though Charles had disappeared. There must have been a method to make succession feel more like continuity than erasure. The first ceremonial draft was pushed across by Anne, the table in her brother's direction. Charles kept his hands off of it. Reaching between them, William flipped the paper and started writing a new order by hand. He suggested that his father be officially recognized as the man who had ensured the transition by resigning before the monarchy was harmed by uncertainty. The retiring sovereign would not be viewed as a vanquished character driven to the brink, but the incoming king would still take the fundamental oath. Anne called for one more adjustment. She insisted that Charles be allowed to attend the event on his own and be officially welcomed prior to William taking the oath. The nation would know exactly what had occurred from just one gesture. A single reign had not been removed. It had purposefully left space for the next. Overlast, Charles glanced over the revised page. He didn't object, but the shaky agreement quickly led to another issue. Emotions within the family could influence the notion of coronation. However, centuries of ritual could not be automatically changed by it. The family had discovered a compromise, but now authority had to determine the extent to which tradition would be compromised. The most poignant family decision of their lives became a realm controlled by protocol once Charles left precedence, symbolism, and oath. William might succeed to the throne. However, no single king can carelessly change the centuries-old expectations associated with a coronation. However, the future ruler was adamant about making one change above all others. In the ceremony his leaving created, his father would not be reduced to an uncomfortable postscript. William knew that every change would be scrutinized when he entered the planning sessions. A sovereign is publicly anointed, crowned, and bound by solemn promises of duty during the ceremonial coronation. Senior ceremonial advisors, church representatives, household officials, and Anne had to determine how much might be changed without taking away the event's constitutional and religious significance. Even though the formal succession had already occurred, that was significant, because William was not only taking over power, but also influencing how the nation would see the end of his father's rule. Then all the formal language was broken by one simple detail. A chair marked the former sovereign caught William's attention. He looked at the card, picked it up from the table, and tore it in half. The prince assured Anne that Charles would not be confined to a seating category during a ceremony that was made possible by his voluntary resignation. At first she remained silent, then her face softened. What all the planning documents had failed to conceal was revealed at that moment. William's guilt persisted. Anne put him to the test. She questioned if his desire for Charles' homage sprang from his uneasiness about assuming the throne or from his ceremonial judgment. William said that he felt guilty. There was no reason for him to dispute it. However, he also maintained that the mere fact that appreciation was associated with suffering did not render it useless. The ceremony had to demonstrate the source of continuation if the monarchy required it. William gave his approval to a number of intentional modifications. There would be less of a procession. There would be fewer levels of magnificence. At the center of the event would be public service. Additionally, Charles would get official recognition prior to the coronation oath. The new sovereign formally accepts the responsibilities of kingship through the oath, which is a solemn pledge. That sequence told the truth, in William's opinion. Authority had obviously moved on, but his father had not been erased. Charles made one personal adjustment. He crossed out a suggested point in which William would formally thank him from the throne when he received the amended manuscript. The king informed his son that the coronation should not become a ritual about the sacrifice of an old monarch, but rather belong to the future ruler. At first, William objected, but his father was unyielding. But beyond that planning table, another effect starting to emerge. Camilla had not yet come to terms with how her own role in royal life would be affected by Charles's permanent retreat. The ceremony was starting to take shape. However, the identical choice was quietly destroying another life beyond the planning table. The family didn't anticipate the consequences coming so quickly. The calendars were altered. Routes for briefings were altered. New guidelines regarding which documents got to William and which no longer needed Charles's consent were given to the staff. But in one brief instant, Camilla's new reality became cruelly apparent. An assistant came in, carrying the official boxes for the following week, past Charles's desk, and put the sovereign documents in the room that was ready for William. Charles stood motionless as the transformation took place all around him. His son was now the focus of important engagements, ceremonial approvals, constitutional papers, and official briefings. The documents a sovereign gets to perform official state functions are known as constitutional papers, and the shift is no longer symbolic once those papers cease to arrive. The machinery of monarchy was shifting, but he still had his place in the family and his own dignity. Camilla also knew what that meant for her. The everyday tasks of a reigning queen could no longer be the focus of her duty. Even the vocabulary surrounding her position in royal life had started to shift overnight. Camilla observed the final official package being taken off the desk. She remained by Charles's side as the door closed, asking if he had anticipated the change to feel so sudden. She reached for the desk, paused before touching it, and said, "It has to." The king turned to face the vacant area where the boxes had always rested. He remained silent. An official announcement would not have had the same impact as the quiet. William experienced the same weight on the other side. The prince eschewed anything that seemed victorious, despite advisors' advice that he project confidence and momentum in his first significant meetings. He warned Anne that any indication of enthusiasm ran the risk of appearing to be a celebration of his father's passing. She reminded him that admitting responsibility did not equate to appreciating how things came about. However, he continued to grapple with the distinction. Charles clarified the permanency even further. He declined to keep up a shadow court, an independent, unauthorized organization that would challenge the power of the new ruler. Only active kingship-related staff positions were closed, merged, or transferred. There would be no more second centers of command. He did, however, make one personal request. He would keep one red dispatch box from his reign as a memento of the weight he had once carried, rather than for formal purposes. A recorded household note later informed William of that desire. Silently, he gave the command to leave the box alone. He was more uneasy about the detail than he had anticipated. His father was giving up nearly everything related to the position, but he was clinging to a tiny reminder of the price. Anne noticed the hesitancy right away. Knowing that the issue was no longer constitutional, she invited William to have a private meeting without advisors. He was no longer afraid of being king by dusk. He was afraid of what the father, who had purposefully made way for him, might do if he became king. Every discussion had been encircled by documents, titles, advisors, and rituals for weeks. At last, Anne got rid of everything. Until the father and son had spoken their true feelings, she urged William to have a private meeting with Charles without any aides, documents, or discussion of constitutional procedure. What transpired next turned out to be the pivotal moment. William said that every preparation felt like another reminder of what Charles had given up, and he had started to fear his coronation. Anne saw hesitancy turning into something more serious, so she set up the meeting. She refused to allow advisors to interrupt her once the father and boy were inside, No one was around to translate feelings into palace language for the first time since the shift started. As an heir, William did not speak. His voice was that of a son. He explained to Charles that while he could appreciate the reasoning behind the decision, it did not allow for rejoicing. Every procession rehearsal, oath debate and crown fitting felt connected to what his father had lost. Charles paid attention without interjecting. Then he confronted the guilt head-on. He informed William that the goal of his own decision would be defeated if he prepared for the coronation oath with shame. A coronation oath is the solemn pledge through which the new sovereign publicly accepts the duties of kingship. The king had refused to abdicate so that his son might apologize for ascending to the throne during the following reign. He had resigned to allow the organization to proceed with assurance. At last, William acknowledged something he had never spoken before. A part of him had continued to hold out hope that Charles might reconsider. The prince had anticipated a reversal even after the planning started and the official documents were relocated. In a hushed reply, his father said that he was stuck halfway between heir and king because of this hope. William would never be able to completely abandon the previous arrangement if he kept looking back. Then Charles pulled out a folded handwritten note from a drawer. It was intended to be opened in private. Prior to the coronation, he clarified, there was no secret plan, no ceremonial order, and no politisking. It was a personal message. Never mistake the wearer of the crown for the crown itself. Power might be transferred, duty may alter. Both had to be survived by the family. William's hand was clasped around the note by Charles as he stretched across the table. For a few seconds, neither man said anything. He did not refer to the prince as the king when he eventually stood. William found Anne outside and assured her that his remorse would not create any further delays, just saying, "Thank you, Papa." The coronation would take place as evidence that Charles's final choice had been successful, rather than as a celebration of his departure. Father and son had at last come to terms with the future within the palace. Millions of people outside were just starting to realize how drastically their kingdom had altered. The private grief of one family had spread across the country by the time the news hit the streets. Schedules were disrupted by broadcasters. All throughout Britain, phones lit up. Near Buckingham Palace, crowds started to arrive, not because a scandal had broken out or because anyone had died, but rather because the nation was dealing with an absolutely unfamiliar situation. While his successor was waiting to be crowned, a monarch had made the decision to permanently depart the hub of royal life. William was significantly less excited by the response than the headlines implied. The unusual character of Charles's permanent retreat, Anne's obvious support, and the coronation plans that were already underway were the main topics of television coverage. A brief transition timetable or organized calendar outlining the transfer of responsibilities from one sovereign to the next was made public by the royal household. This information was important since it assured the public that there wouldn't be a protracted time of uncertainty. With purposeful speed, the monarchy was shifting hands. When one presenter spoke about Charles almost exclusively in the past tense and referred to the event as the start of his reign, William tensed. Catherine saw right away. After observing him for a few moments, she discreetly turned off the TV. The prince didn't protest. He merely stated that, rather than making a choice, the wording gave the impression that his father had vanished. He was no longer sure that the public would comprehend, but Catherine reminded him that it would take time. A different kind of communication was sent to Anne. According to briefing summaries, the public's appreciation for her brother is growing, with many viewing his departure as a sign of self-control rather than defeat. Inside the palace walls, she had spent weeks explaining the emotional significance of his decision. However, she was more affected than she anticipated when she saw that strangers could relate. One summary was dropped, and the princess said that she had been afraid Charles would be regarded as a man who was unable to carry on. Rather, people were starting to perceive someone who had decided to stay in the monarchy as being stuck. Then, all of a sudden, the atmosphere was entirely different. Above the assembling crowd outside Buckingham Palace was a handwritten placard. "Charles, thank you. William, we're prepared." Around it, applause erupted. A national newspaper created an equally impressive front page titled "The King Who Made Way" for dramatic media coverage. All of a sudden, the narrative was no longer presented as a crisis. It was turning into a narrative of purposeful succession. William called Anne into the room after taking another look at the crowd on a muted television. Neither of them talked at first when the sign showed. After a few moments of staring at the TV, the prince nodded when she eventually remarked, "They understood him." The last emotional barrier was removed by that insight. Every time his father's name was brought up, William no longer felt compelled to defend the change. The family could ultimately determine the true significance of this occasion once the nation recognized the sacrifice as the conclusion of one reign and the start of another, not as constitutional history. Charles's resignation ultimately did not turn into a tale of a monarch being overthrown. It turned into a tale about understanding when letting go would be more beneficial to the crown than keeping on. William's revised plans for his coronation ceased to appear as proof of a rift within the family and instead became the ultimate manifestation of his father's choice. When duty threatened to be overtaken by emotion, Anne, who had challenged both men, suddenly realized what they had been attempting to construct. William gave his unqualified approval to the completed edifice. Charles would be formally honored prior to the new sovereign taking the core oath, and the ritual would focus on service, continuity, and duty. The oath's placement inside the ceremony makes its purpose evident. It is the solemn pledge by which a monarch officially accepts the responsibilities of kingship. One reign was coming to an end with honor, while another was starting with complete power. After reviewing the final draft, Anne did not oppose it for the first time. Charles embraced his new position with equal vigor. He would no longer back any independent organization that would challenge William's power or carry out the constitutional duties of a sovereign. His future would be revered, intimate, and family-oriented, but clearly outside the monarchy's operational hub. The monarch reviewed the authorized coronation program, closed the folder, and pushed it in the direction of his son for the last private review. He didn't change anything. "It is no longer my ceremony to shape," he replied. William accepted the folder without objecting. That simple movement marked the moment he finally stopped treating acceptance like betrayal. Honoring his father no longer meant hesitating before the crown. It meant carrying the responsibility fully. After keeping a close eye on him, Anne turned to face her brother and informed Charles that stepping aside might one day be remembered as his last conscious act of kingship. Before uncertainty could bring instability to the organization he had dedicated his life to serving, he had opted for stable succession. Charles put down the pen and signed the final ceremonial approval. He then moved it in William's direction. It was taken by the prince. Anne herself shut the empty document case. No one inquired as to whether the monarch may come back. No one proposed a second review. That option was eliminated. Now the coronation's significance was full. It wouldn't be a victory over Charles. Furthermore, it would not serve as a monument to what he had given up. It would stand for consistency. One guy acknowledged that his chapter was over. Another acknowledged that he could no longer be put off, and a family made the decision to serve without pretending it was painless. Charles had not lost the throne. By purposefully placing it in William's future, he made sure that Britain would see the successful transition from one reign to the next at the time of the next coronation. I appreciate your reading.